Greetings and welcome to Maisha Kazini. I am very honored to have Darius Okolla with us, who is going to break down the economy for us so that we understand why Kenya is in this moment and maybe also get some inspiration on how to think of a way forward. So, karibu Darius.
Thank you for having me.
You know, you're the one who inspired Maisha Kazini conversations because you were the first.
Oh, really? Now we are back again.
Yeah, you were the first. And I'd said at the end, hey, actually, this is a good idea. I need to do this more.
I'm honored. I'm honored to, be back again. A lot of development in between.
Yes.
It's an ongoing conversation. So yeah, I can always be back again and again to what's new and what's old that's up again. Yeah.
Yeah, and you remember I even told you to about half an hour to the end, it's like you predicted what is happening now with the protest. I don't know, how are you reflecting on that?
I mean, if being honest, Wendia, I remember after that article, there are a couple of gentlemen, some in the humanitarian space, in government right now. We had very long conversations. They would go into the dead of the night and, at hotels, cafes, dozens of conversations, and they were very dismissive of, the predictions I'd made. And I think my exasperation came from the fact that you don't want to be in this kind of a space before you fix some things. There are things that are said right now by Gen Zs, which fundamentally would have been addressed 6-7 years ago when I wrote the Millennial series. So it feels like you're stuck in a time warp. It's like, this is an old problem taking a new language and new dimension, and it doesn't have to be that way. So it's a mixture of, I don't even feel, it's not schadenfreude. It's just, it shouldn't have to be, this kind of stagnation. We can do better as a country. We have the resources, we have the people, we have even the opportunity and the insights to be able to move this conversation. So when you're back to an old problem again and again, something's wrong. And I hope this time we'll fix it for good.
Yeah, the problem is the governing ideas, I think. And it's so hard to break those ones because there are people who are invested in them. And when we did our memorial for David Graeber, that's kind of what we were trying to hit at. These ideas of what does work mean, what does change mean, what do the arts do. We had attacked all the corners. We even talked about NGOs. In fact, you changed my view of NGOs. We talked about the church. So we covered.
Yeah. It's like going back to it and saying, oh, okay, this one we covered it here, this one, we tackled it here. We said a few things that could have been built upon. And that's my hope that this time round, it's an opportunity for a reflection for the country. What I think is different now that wasn't there when we had this generational conversation 5-6 years ago was the fact that my working thesis of this is that, the 2010 basically constitution ushered in what you call the Second Republic, if so to speak, within political and democracy rather dimensions. What that does is that it means there are a lot of old logics that even if they stuck around, their guiding principles and their stickability, so to speak, has been waning and decaying over time. Some of these things died in 2007. The old idea of what Kenya was, and but of course these systems I always say they're like a big ship. It has like 4 ballast tanks to keep it afloat. So you can breach the first one and the second one, but it's still moving. But the perceptive people can tell you this thing, it's just a matter of time. So, I don't know whether to call it the gift or the burden of perception, where you're able to look into the future and do some prophetic work. But then, it's not always appreciated until the signs are here with us. So fundamentally, a lot of that old logics, the thing about these kinds of logic is that they develop a language, they have resources, they have vested interests, So they might die today, but you'll bury it 20 years from now. So it's
gosh.
Yeah, in public policy we call it the problem with the lagging indicators.
Yes.
That
I
by the time
to check that one.
Yeah, by the time you can tell this thing is going down, it's been going down for a while, but because of how formidable it is and the mechanisms it sustains itself with. I mean, it has a language, it has structures, it has institutions, sometimes even international ratification. So by the time you come around to seeing it really go down, it's been a minute. And I think what's different this time around is, I mean, we call it the Gen Z revolution, but I keep telling people it encompasses all the, the clusters. What's different now is the fact that essentially political messaging, simplicity over nuance. So when we call it Gen Z revolution, it means that Gen Zs now are the embodiment of a wide range of grievances, unsolved issues, and realized collective and individual dreams that are culminating into this particular moment. And because of that, essentially, we have to call it Gen Z revolution. But it's really the whole civic public and the listening public saying, time is up.
Yeah, because in a sense, the reason, okay, I wouldn't say I get Gen Z, let me not be so presumptive, but there was a way in which I was also feeling that I had been shut out of the economy. It was in terms of the culture and maturity. I noticed my generation, people like me were not being allowed to mature. So you get your PhD and 10 years later, you're still being workshopped because, there's this new thing that you don't know and now you have to know. So I started wondering, when do I get to be an elder? When do I get to teach? When does my experience count for something? But now I think the Gen Zs, for them, it has a direct economic impact. It means they can't enter the economy at all. So I don't know whether that's the same thing in a way.
It is. When you think about it, Gen Zs can see through these illusions in ways that we have not. One of them is, for example, when your generation is barely ahead of us, but technically, your generation can't retire.
Yes.
Only 26% of Kenyans can, are saving for retirement. Your average Kenyan, when they go into retirement, their income drops by 70%. By the time your average Kenyan is going into retirement, they only have 36 months worth of savings. And the recent data says 82% of Kenyans who retire go back into employment within 8 months of retirement. They basically exhausted what they have. So 4 in 5 elders are out here chasing the same labor opportunities with the millennials and the Gen Z kids. So the older generation are essentially stuck. They can't retire. Then the millennial generation, what's interesting is that between 2008 and 2018, income adjusted for inflation stagnated. So basically what you're making was not high enough to beat the inflation. And so inflation is eating into the value of your incomes. In the last 4 years, that has happened again. So incomes are down 10 to 15%. Because for the last 4 consecutive years, incomes adjusted for inflation have been lower, which means millennials are stuck. It's a stalled mobility, so to speak. And what's interesting about that is the Gen Zs are looking at their parents. They're like, my parents can't afford to retire. And retirement benefits authority says about 88% of Kenyans get to retirement age when they still have dependents. So their last born is in high school or something like that. So they're looking at their parents, they're like, this is the death of process, so to speak. The elders can't become elders and they can't retire. The millennials who are their elder siblings are stalled and they're saying, if it didn't work for my parents, it didn't work for my elder siblings who are the millennials, I have no illusion it will work for me. So these kids just have a clearer idea of the fact that we have an amazing country, we have a very large economy, but the mechanics and the systems of control and resource production and distribution that we put in place are not able to provide for people, are not able to compensate people commensurate with the productivity they're putting in. And so these kids are saying, you know what, A plus B plus C plus D does not lead to E, so spare me the illusion, you know. And I think that's the conversation we should be having going into these protests. Yeah.
And you see, even when I read David Graeber, that's when the scales fell off my eyes. I was like, this is it. This is why I feel we are not moving. But
Yeah.
I know I'm asking a rhetorical question, but let me ask it. How come we can't see it? What is it? I don't get it. What is it? Because I can see even the government, they still have not understood where we are. I don't get it. Which world are they in? Is it Davos world? Is it that they, do they not watch the news? I mean, okay. Where do they live? And yet we're in the same country.
It's a question of history and of education, which is what you do. The philosophy of our education, first of all, when they said all you needed to know is to read and write, but also number two, we are so unmoored from the lived reality of Kenyans and how that should be core in terms of the kind of philosophy or the why of our education system. So everything you say is the problem, actually. When you tell them, this education system does not prepare you for this society, how to make it better, that is foundational to this. The other one is we have not created a repository of historical information that can enable people contextualize and find the turning points within the history. So you'll teach me, and I mean, Dr. Mordecai mentioning, you're teaching me about Saskatchewan and what's happening out there, and it's all beautiful stuff, rice farming here and wheat farming there. But then, Kenyans always make this joke that I've never found a Kariandusi near Gilgil my whole life. And we say it as a joke, but something that was so core to our education system, but translating this very common knowledge into some sort of a geographical consciousness, and not even at an academic level, but just out of the curiosity to say, okay, so really, where is this Kariandusi? It tells you that kind of a disconnect. Like it's taught within a certain abstractions that unmoors it from our lived everyday experiences in such a way that this knowledge becomes just a tool. Once we are done with reproducing it within the exam mechanisms, I guess we are done. And then we come out here and you sort of have to build a whole new a repository of realities. And there aren't many references points within how we've structured our philosophy of education and even within the curriculums that then can say, the question is, what kind of a human do we want to produce, at the end of both the schooling system, but generally within the education system. So we decide what goes into the classroom, what doesn't, but is still important enough in the creation of this human that, will make Kenya flourish. So there's a lot of, and I'm glad in the last few years, you've done quite a bit of work in there and, all the storytelling. I see a lot of people do storytelling about our histories, about personalities. That is really core to bridging that gap. Yeah. And something that almost like psychosis. Yeah.
But from what I've seen in graduate education, I mean, Kenyans should go, let me just say, Kenyans should go to scholar.google.com and look at Kenyan theses. No. And I'm a lecturer and I'm saying, no, we have to do something because we can't keep on doing this thing because, you're saying this, that we are not connected to reality. But how many students are doing questionnaires which they are supposedly giving people and then filling in the forms and whatever, and then doing some very detailed calculations, producing some statistics? They actually think they are connected to reality. That's the thing. And then when you start saying, hey, these mathematical things don't address a philosophical problem, then they say, okay, what's your solution? So the education system is just feeding this hubris.
Yeah, so we definitely are coming to an end of that. We no longer have as much headroom for, that kind of hazing and the funneled model to produce the tyranny of the 5%. The 5% is no longer 5% in this kind of a hyper-visible and hyper-connected world. Generally, a lot of people can see, what's going on out there. Even the 5% themselves are probably 12% now, and the limited resources for which they would allow the hazing so that they could fit in is no longer fit for purpose, even for them. So the moment of reckoning is here. I mean, it'll take many dimensions, these protests and all these, and me, I'm up here for it. It's a long journey, but we buckle up and we play our part in it. So even for them, it's not working. I mean, if you look at one of the threads during the protest, people are saying, I got these marks, I went and started this course, the labor market hasn't worked for me. I've done this, I've done that, I've jumped through these hoops that, we're told are the social markers of upward mobility within the Kenyan state, and it hasn't translated. So, and the beauty of digital media and digital platforms is that it allows you to be able to, hear from a diversity of voices. Isn't it amazing that maybe 17, 18 years ago, if it wasn't in the news, on the radio, or the newspaper, it didn't happen. Now that's no longer the case. And that's some massive progress. We can't underestimate its power. So the diversity of voices that are very articulate, and they're speaking into the dysfunctionality of, the current social construct that is called Kenya. It gives a space for really, really amazing voices and divergent perspectives. And for me, I'm up for it. It's growing pains, but then that's a future of progress. So I'm up for it. Yeah.
Me, I want that heat which is being put on the feet of the church. I want it to be moved to be done to education. Hey, no, we can't. Yeah, we cannot keep doing this. Hey, no. Anyway, okay. So today we are having an economics lesson. So I've come with questions. I have my pen here. I'm going to take notes so that I get this correct. Okay. I think it's important we start from colonialism in terms of, we're always being told about the political side of it, but were colonies profitable? What in the long run, did colonies become profitable?
Well, we talk about, and in school back then, they used to call it the scramble and partition of Africa. But that is, and then we put it at the 1884 Berlin Conference, but that's not entirely accurate. The scramble started way before the partition.
Yes.
So the scramble used to be, you could look at 1498 with, Ruto's friend Vasco da Gama, you could come closer, look at all, what was his name, the Chinese explorer whose ship sank in Lamu around 1600, Zheng He. You could look at throughout the age of discovery, or you could come forward and look at it, let's say from 1860.
Okay.
What's interesting is all through that window, the British used to trade here. A lot of the trade that happened back then, the Dutch were here, and all these powers. What was interesting is that the trade starts in human bodies. It's slavery, basically, the Middle Passage. So you have, it was trade in black bodies. And, back then communities were small. There was no methods of, like foreign exchange. There were no rules around. So it was, you capture able-bodied men and women, you put them on the ship, and then you go and sell them. But sometime around 1860, 1860, give or take, something begins to change. When these Dutch and the British ships would come to trade locally, first of all, that's around the time the ban on slave trade begins to be enforced in many parts around the world.
Yes.
So you need something else to trade in. What is it? Raw materials. But then, so what happens is, when these ships are coming down, they begin to find Germans are here, the French are here, the Spanish armadas are here. So rivalry begins to rise, among these big powers. So the scramble is going on, but each one spy, there's no defined boundaries of who's trading with who. And, so it's not entirely profitable. So one interesting thing that happens is that back home, this is also the time the Franco-Prussian War is coming up. right? That should have been around 1870, 1871.
I was teaching about it last week. Yeah. It's
yeah.
1870.
So the partition is part of a consequence of that. You know, when the Allied German states come together, and then there's the fight, and the concession is it at the Battle of Sedan. That's Napoleon III. Yeah. When those concessions are made, then these powers realize, you know, at home things are not, you know, you can no longer throw your weight around in continental Europe. And because you're already trading out there, why don't we sit down, come up with a method of dividing that place? They didn't like each other that much anyway.
Yes.
But they're saying, if we find a way to partition that, you know, dark wasted and occupied lands out there, continent, then we can each profit from it. So that is the first point where they begin now to, you know, to create these distinctions. You take, you know, as Italians take this, the Portuguese take that. So fundamentally, what happens in there is, because now you've been given a particular swath of land or property, the other dynamic that comes with it is then now you need to enforce political domination, because now you have a geography within which you need to trade, and what you're trading in is supposed to be profitable. So in a sense, political domination becomes a necessary condition in the search for profitability. So fundamentally, it was profitable, but then that was for the traders. Eventually, of course, there's the railway that comes up, which I think we'll come to that again, and the dynamics that changes.
Let me interrupt there. How does the state start? I mean, what's the logic of the state getting involved? Because even when you look at India, in fact, I was thinking of India when you were talking, how it was just goons, really. British goons going to India, looting it, and then bringing the loot, the way our MPs do. You go to the coffers in Nairobi, bring the loot home and distribute. So, and you use it to gain political mileage, yeah? I don't know whether I've captured that economic model. So it sounded to me when I was reading that, it sounded to me like that was private enterprise. So what was the political logic that made the governments now take it up?
I mean, there are two dimensions to it. One of them is when these traders come out here, a lot of them do not belong to the nobles and the lords and the monarchs. Yes. They're just a bunch of, you know, very hyper-ambitious fellows. But then they come out here, they make so much money, and then they go back home and say, you know, I'm just rich as I'm rich as the king. What do you mean I'm a commoner? And now the empire or the respective empires have to make concessions. You create these titles of sirs, and you know, you begin to give them some titles, and you create, you know, all these distinctions, House of Lords and House of Commons and all these. So the empire didn't anticipate how wealthy these, you know, fellows who are going out there would become. So by the time they're coming back home, and then they begin to, so part of the profit, of course, comes back home. But empire still wasn't as interested in what's happening out here. For a lot of them, it was safety valve. You spend quite a bit of time on war. You have all these working age population. Your war economy is shrinking. They need to go somewhere. So initially, it's the Wild West, so to speak. You know, the ruffians and the goons and all these, you know, misfits. You know, you kick them out to go out there and, you know, take the adventure away from the country and not be a nuisance to, you know, your civic public. But then they're making so much resources out there, and any government would definitely want to look at what are those people doing out there, because then with that kind of resources,
it's affecting us eventually. These guys are bringing the loot from other countries and coming to challenge our power here.
Yeah. So there was that, but then you come to, so there was the Dutch East Africa, there's the Imperial British East Africa, which of course collapses eventually, and then the Foreign Office has to take over, and that's where we had that transition. So 1897, Declaration of Protectorate. You go into 1902, you have what, the Crown Land Ordinance, which basically declared all lands, you know, under the Crown. Then there's the amendment made in 1915, which extended the powers, giving the, you know, the white minorities about, you know, 99 year leases, and, you know, whatever land you found out there, you know, essentially becomes yours. So by the time you're getting into...
Just because we've kind of gone into the next question, why were they building the railway? Who was building it? It was a private enterprise.
It was from the public offers, and just to be clear, the old railway, which starts what, 1895, 1896. What's interesting about it is that by the current calculation, it costs about £5 million. So it was just as unprofitable as SGR, you know. And the British Parliament and the British politicians were incensed when they had the amounts being spent on it. It didn't make economic sense.
Wait. Sorry, I have to. It was a tender. Yeah,
it was, and it cost a lot. And so these guys were, I mean, they came. In fact, the word we use for it, the lunatic, we call it the lunatic express.
Yes.
But the lunatic line actually came from a British journalist who was like, this is total lunacy, you know, it does not make sense at all. Yeah. So
it was back corruption. At home. It was basically corruption.
Yeah. Yes, it was. And what's interesting about it is that it wasn't built for Kenya. It was built for, there was this desire to sort of create something between, say, Mombasa and Cairo, Egypt, but through, of course, the Nile. So the Nile was really the target in this. It was, they said, if you reach the Nile and then you can follow the Nile to Cairo, Egypt, you really would have conquered this region. So essentially it was this clusters trying to reach Uganda, basically. And so Kenya became a strategic, part of that dynamic. So when they get to Kisumu, and then they're heading towards Lake Albert, that becomes essentially, so because you've already built it, now you need to begin to find models and ways of repaying it. But then Kenya was never really, it was part of that, like within the strategic dynamics, but it wasn't central to what they're trying to do. So then what do you do? Because now you have Kenya in between, which takes up almost 890 something kilometers of that trail. So now you start selling Kenya as, this wild land you can go to, the Happy Valley kind of a thing. So tourism, basically, you begin to sell, there's free land out there and there's a railway on it. Come over, you can get a few thousands of acres, sit around, get some more, working age population, people to work for you. So Kenya almost becomes, we need to pay for this thing, so we need a model of, how do you do it? And that's really adverts online. I think I saw Levin Opio share one. I'll need to look up. I'm sure you can get it on Google, which just essentially, it was sort of like a brand Kenya marketing kind of a thing. And it's basically saying, come over, there's free land out there. It's a place with the wild animals and everything.
And which is to work for you.
Yeah, and what's like interesting about
buying company, the ones we do now with the gated communities and blah blah.
Yes, I mean, when you think about it, what, and that's how people like Theodore Roosevelt ends up here, the father of the Kenyan conservation model. I mean, he comes with his crew and they kill thousands of giraffes and buffaloes and elephants and all these animals. And in fact, part of his remarks, he says that was my last chance to be a boy. He was in 50 something then, almost. Yeah.
No.
Yeah. So, I mean, there's an interesting dynamic that goes on with the colonial economy up, let's say, until 1920, which is,
Of course. I mean, how does a whole president come to fulfill boyish dreams here? I mean, like, oh no, that's just so...
That's what you marketed to him. I mean, you told him, come out here, shoot some wild animals. It's a wild open savanna. I mean, so, it's so for those who are marketing it, it made them money. I mean, he had almost 250 potterers to help him carry around stuff, so...
And I used to whip them and mistreat them.
It made their bottom line. I mean, so technically that, and of course, given that his legacy in terms of setting up conservation in the US, of course, part of that also sits here. So he's almost pretty much the Kenya of, the father of Kenyan conservation, so to speak. And of course, in the US, he implemented it differently, with the Yellowstone National Park and the Grand Canyon and all that. But here it takes on a significantly very racialized angle, So, And I mean, Mordecai and then Baria have written about what that legacy has looked like over the last couple of decades. Yeah.
So just to clarify, the railway was built, was it owned? Okay, I understand it was built with British taxpayers' money, but was it owned by the public or it was a private company? What is this Imperial British East African Company? What is that?
It was a company built to help the British regime basically manage its foreign businesses. But then it collapses at of sorts, but then more focused on foreign business interests. Okay. Not just in Kenya, but around the country, because there was a British East India, and all that. So what happens is that at some point it collapses and then the Foreign Office takes over. And that's around the time when now Kenya moves from the East African Protectorate to become the British colony. I think about 2 years or a year later. Yeah. So
from what I'm hearing, Kenyan has never had a production-based economy. It has always been leisure and it's always been a leisure economy.
I mean, we had, there was that sort of colonial economy, but we had our native economy. People were producing, people were selling way before that. So this is sort of, what they bring on board. But before that, there was a lot of trade going back thousands of years, really, the Lambos, and, so this was their production model, where they're saying, within this colonial modernity, we want you to do A, B, C, D. But production has always been going on here. We had our craftsmen, we had our trade, we had our trade routes. This was just a new introduction into what we already had within the country.
Yeah, forgive me, I had not thought of that. So what's the clash between the two? Because clearly this is one economic model and there's another one which now Africans are doing. They're still trading. In fact, one of the ones I've talked about is the what do you call it? The destocking controversy of Ukambani, where they wanted to force people from that area into the economy by destroying their cattle. So so that has been, is that the relationship that has been there till this day? A clash between the Kenyan, the African economy that's dynamic and productive, and the colonial state that is based on titles, leisure, and...
I mean, what's interesting there that happens is that when you go into the 1920s, you begin to have these pushbacks, the late come up,
like Mekatilili, even, when they were refusing to pay taxes, become soldiers and do the, what do you call it? The sisal plantation.
Yeah. There are those. So these two economies are running parallel, but then they begin to integrate, because economic freedom in this country always follows political freedom. And so you have the Lejkos, you have the young Kavirondos. Among my people, there used to be a famous phrase, Pinio Wacho, the people have spoken. So when they'll come and take your cows because you haven't paid taxes, there are some politicians, very fiery ones, who would go and collect those cows from them and bring back to the people. So it's an interesting dynamic that goes on into 1920s and partly into 1930s. And what's interesting about the Lejko elections, and then you're privy to that, is the exclusion of Black people. So what they would do is they would have, these laws for white people, and then these laws for Indians, and then these laws for the Coloreds and everybody else. But the Indians used to refuse to participate in it because they said, there's nothing different between us and these people. We actually built the railway, and so they boycotted the Lejko elections 3 or 4 times, if I'm not wrong, going well into the 1930s, from I think the 1920s. But then what's also interesting happening around this time is by the time you're going into this, Kenya used to, at least the communities at the coast, were trading a lot with the foreign organizations. And so in terms of currencies, we had about 4 or 5 different currencies in Kenya around that time. The Americans had gotten the independence, so they are coming with their silver dollars. The British were trading with what they used to call pice, which is where we get pesa. The Indian rupee was here, which gives a lot of our communities use that rupee and a variation of that because of the Indian rupees. And so as the lunatic express goes, inland, what happens is that, there's more trading happening now. The cash economy is beginning to expand inland. And by the time you get into 1930s, something interesting happens, especially around late 30s. First of all, the Italians who are taken over the northern part of Kenya, the Somali, I mean, they had a massive military economy, and the British were always very scared of them. So the British tried a lot to incorporate the coastal communities into, their army so that they could build a formidable army. They tried, what else? Something else that happens is the Ukambani belt. That's the time there was that major drought, which actually, I was looking up the history of that. It cut all the way to Lodwell. I mean, the 1938, 39 to like around 42, there was a major drought. So a lot of people figured out, and crop failure. So a lot of people begin to say, you know what, if I'm having successive crop failures, then I might as well join this army of theirs or go work for them. So you have this cash economy beginning to expand and integrate people who would have otherwise stayed out of it. I mean, there's, of course, the culling of cows and livestock as part of punishing people into joining it. And so you're getting into the 1930s, political freedom is expanding, the lunatic express is here, there are more people, but it's very gradual in terms of the integration of, the African economy into this colonial economy. But then you get to 1940s and that accelerates. Because remember, this is also the time Hitler is going after Austria. The global war economy is expanding. By the end of that war, how many Kenyans fought? About 100,000 Kenyans fought in World War II. And when you think about it, the population of Kenya was what, maybe 3 million, give or take.
That's a huge percentage.
Yeah. So that's a massive military economy that we had throughout the 1940s. So there are Kenyans who are fighting here, there are Kenyans who are fighting, the Italians and the Germans. There are Kenyans who went to fight in Burma and India. And, some of them went to French Algeria up there. I mean, so there's this, a lot of people getting integrated into the cash economy through the war economy, so to speak. They need boots, they need, on the ground, they need guns, they need gunpowder, they need porters, they need all these things. So the Kenyan economy in the 1940s, you can almost say it was a military economy, because but also what happens is that there's a huge demand for tea and for tobacco also, because of the soldiers fighting out there. And so if you look at like our labor history, there are about 200,000 people who went to work in the White Islands to produce more coffee and more tea rather, and tobacco that was exported to all these soldiers abroad. So in the East, you have this conscription to protect to create a buffer against the Italian Somali side, because these colonials didn't even like each other either. On the central side, you have this drought that is ravaging, and people are like, if I can't get successive crop failure, I have a family to feed, I need this, I need that. So I'm going to work for these people reluctantly. In the western parts where you have all these cash crop areas, or what we call the White Islands, people are signing up because there's a huge demand for all these cash crops abroad. So pretty much across the country, for different reasons, people are jumping into this cash economy. So by the time you are coming to the tail end of the 1940s, you have a significant portion of Kenyans directly or indirectly feeding into this military economy, which was quite a defining moment for us, both in the direct boots on the ground, but also in terms of just general labor productivity to feed that global war machinery. Yeah.
Okay. Just go over, I know you've kind of mentioned it, but just go over what was the logic of having settlers in Kenya? Was it an economic decision, or they just wanted white bodies for political power, or both?
Yeah. I mean, it was incidental. You've created the railway. It's bringing back money, but then you have all these quote unquote West and unoccupied lands under the Crown Lands Ordinance. You remember the 1902 and the one in 1915. So essentially, you have a lot of this land, and you need people here to help you sort of manage this colony of yours. So you offer it to all different kinds of people. There are those who are told, come here as farmers. There's a lot of white islands here. You can take over. There are those, people like Erwin Grogan, the famous Grogan. I mean, the guy was just a lunatic. You tell him, go out there. Don't make a mess back at home. Just go be a nuisance to Africans down there, So
like
the
Australia, basically.
Yeah.
You just go throw your criminals to the colonies. In a sense, that's what Hannah Arendt says. She says that there were all these dysfunctional white men who could not accomplish anything at home, so they were told, go evacuate your demons in the colonies.
Yeah, and so you have people who are being offered adventure, come out here for safari, so it's tourism, it's agriculture, it's how to get rid of your misfits. I mean, so it's a whole land where once you call it Western and unoccupied, you just go dump everyone there. So there are all these diverse interests of people coming out here. And of course, some settle, some stick around a bit, some leave. But on overall, it was like 4 or 5 sort of interest groups that, you would challenge. Those who wanted to trade in a lot of these what do you call it, wild game. So people like Zimmerman, the famous Zimmerman state, I mean, they had at some point running pretty much one of the largest facilities of producing wild game, wild meat, and wild, so what is now Zimmerman Estate, you have the Don Holmes who are, agricultural guys, so you're telling them, come here, set up around Outari, what we call now Outari, put your cattle and your sheep and, get some of these black bodies to work for you and, you make some good money. So it was, there are all these diverse interests involved in the economy at that point. Yeah.
So okay, gosh, you've disrupted so many things. I'm struggling to sort of grasp what you're saying. So up to the 1940s and slightly beyond, Kenya was not this linear, white man, black man, settler as economy. There were many more things happening. I mean, I'd never even seen this tourism angle, leisure thing as part of the economic logic. But what you're saying is that there were many things happening in the colony at the time.
Yes, there were diverse and competing interests coming out here, taking care of those, and sometimes there were even clashes between them. Of course, we include people like the Ludwig Crafts, now the missionary communities coming up, the Joan Rebman, and, coming out here. And of course, they were setting their own, the colonial modernity, so to speak, the mission school, the mission hospitals, the mission churches.
In fact, now you can go to that question of what was the role of the missionaries in the economy.
Yeah, we sort of tend to give them, we've always, and there are people who've written about it, people like Frank Bosch, who, speaking to, when they ended up here, there was, a significant cultural mistakes created because it was almost like we are preparing you for civilization because the markers of modernity and civilizations were all within this mission, colonial metrics of power. So essentially, in many ways, even the translation of even those religious texts that they're claiming to preach come out way later. And, so there were clashes, but on the overall, everyone was at the service of empire. So they were preparing people for this sort of colonial modernity, getting you out of, the sort of primitivity, so to speak, at least how they framed it. There was a significant element in terms of just the running of these institutions that they've created, because a lot of them also became the stopover points and the touching points for the colonial dynamic coming here. So there's a significant baggage that goes with the missionary work, whether some of them were genuine or some of them were pretty much also fulfilling their rational mission through some theological excuse, definitely can be written out. What's interesting, I came across a bit of literature from, I think, 2 years ago, which said some of the Blacks within empire who are already living in the empire, and within theologians who wanted to come out here or were being discouraged or forbade from coming out here, which tells you this was, as much as it was framed as a theological, missionary or missional journey to the frontiers, the racial element was never lost to them, and in subtle and not so subtle ways was always enforced. So they are not innocent in the colonial establishment of and in the service of empire. Yeah.
The other day I went for a funeral of one of the luminaries of the PCEA, and the moderator said something in passing which I thought was quite interesting. He said that when the missionaries came, the Scots, they were preaching the 3 C's: colonial, it wasn't colonialism, Christianity, commerce, and civilization. So commerce was there. So what specific, I don't know, I'm still yet to look at what the missionaries were thinking about commerce, but might you know anything about it? What specifically were they saying about their economic role in the country?
I mean, they played a good role in terms of keeping their hands off. The civilization element of it was the entry point into the commerce. So it was, okay. I mean, they did their trading, but then within, so say, there used to be clothes called America back then within the colonial economy. And the essence of that was these clothes actually came from, empire, but then it was part of the trading dynamic. But what's interesting is that you find a significant portion of that was intertwined within the centers that they created, because the centers of civilization within colony were mostly, those missional elements. So every other civilizing aspects, even commerce, would develop around it. You build a church, you build a school, you build a hospital. Yes. Then the shops will come with that. And then the cash economy would come with that. So you begin to develop around this essentially Christianity or whatever missional centers you created. So, but some of it was direct, some of it was incidental, but definitely no one was innocent in this scheme of things.
Yeah. That now makes sense. I was trying to look for the connection between the missionary and the capitalist state. Although there's somebody who has written a book on this, I think it's Olufemi Taiwo, where he was saying in this book of his about how Europe prevented modernity, he says that the job of missionaries was to train Africans for capitalism. And that's, I mean, some of them, their evidence of conversion was being able to be in the cash economy. It wasn't just, oh, I am saved and what, but you're able to show that you're in the cash economy. And so in that way, they promoted capitalism. The other thing I found interesting was that missionaries had this middle class ideology, that they believed that the middle class is the class that promotes empire. The aristocrats are just there to make it look good and do symbolic power, but it's the middle class who are the drivers of empire. And so that's how they were thinking in their education, that education is for training a middle class that will expand empire. I don't know.
I mean, what's always interesting about how the dynamics play out is a lot of the aristocrats didn't even want to be out here until the places were fairly developed. I mean, a lot of them were comfortable back at home. These sides, it's wild out there, wild west. So, yeah. So the people who are coming here literally, even those misfits, are fairly middle class back at home. So in a sense, it was incidental transposition of who they were back there, the class identity and the class dynamics, and who then becomes the lead in these frontiers. So some of that was incidental, and of course they would have co-opted that because it helps them to ingratiate themselves into the colonial metrics of power, the colonial modernity that they're building, both incidentally and directly, and then who then becomes their best liaison in terms of their stay here, but also the ability to connect back at home. I mean, the aristocrats wouldn't have bothered to get the masses down here, but they needed people to be able to read, to be able to do this. So in a sense, the middle class, that class identity was simply transposition from where they were and what was fit for purpose within a rapidly developing empire and colonial modernity out there in the frontiers. So, I mean, the aristocrats, for the most part, would care less, you know. Yeah.
So basically, part of why they needed to stay in this middle class identity is so that they could be always negotiating with London and saying, no, we are not against you. We are not trying to be independent, so that you keep London power on your side, kind of. Because I remember I was reading some documents of British settlers still going back to London all the time to lobby for more money. And they were complaining, why isn't London taking care of us? Why isn't London employing our children? Because they were saying the European children born in Kenya were not being employed by the colonial government. So they didn't want to cut off completely from London. And so they needed to maintain this middle class identity so as to say, I'm not competing with you. I still need your help, kind of.
Yes, and also back at home, there was a certain sense of, like, not home, like here and now where they were based, there was a certain element of aspiration and mobility to that also, because when you're able to show the Blacks that, you can read like me, you can dress like me, you can be like me, you can do this and that, you can do all these sort of markers of modernity, then it also becomes one of the endearing aspects of bringing people into the colonial modernity and into, that they're established. So at home, so in a sense, there is a bit of displacement for them. They don't entirely fit here because they're an aspirational class that create this sense of social upward mobility. But back at home, people will be like, what are you doing thousands of kilometers out there in the bush? So they have to go back and keep reaffirming essentially their mission and how it connects with the goals of empire. Otherwise, they would have easily been cut off. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
And then, of course, the empire was on economics, technically. So they, unless you told them the economic dimension of this, it was harder to be able to essentially say why they should maintain you out there. So there was a certain also level of dislocation for them, but they signed up for it. So,
Yani Darius, you've just complicated colonialism for me. I've realized I don't understand that much about it. Oh my. Okay. I'm going to ask you later on how come our elites are they feel so aristocratic-ish, but we'll come to that later. Now we are heading towards the 1941 with the Second World War. Where do the colonial dynamics fit into the madness in Europe?
I mean, at this point, of course, the drum, the drum, the wars are coming up. Everybody is trying to marshal, their tongues. The war economy is global at this point. So everybody's looking at Hitler. He's taking Poland. He's taking Austria. Where is this guy going? The Soviet Union are looking at this and they're like, we have to stop this guy. So everybody was focused on that. And what's interesting is then we get co-opted into that. And that's, I think I mentioned earlier in the 1940s, where you have Kenyans going to Burma, Kenyans going to India. But then also technically you're looking at there's need for tobacco, there's need for tea, there's need for all these cash crops to go feed these troops who are out there. Then you have, the crop failure in Lower and Upper Eastern, and people need to be able to make cash to be able to survive because they're losing their livestock and they're losing their crops. And then there is the fears about, the German Tanganyika and the Italian Somali are taking over that whole Pate, Lamu, Mombasa stretch or the Tudiani. So the war economy, incidentally, accidentally, and sometimes deliberately, is co-opting everyone. Everybody's jumping on board, and we're going into the war economy means going into the cash economy because it's the element of modernity at this point. So by the time the war is over, I think it's Taban Loliong who talks about the three people who changed the Black dynamics: Hitler, Nietzsche, and what the third guy? I think it's the third. I would remember that, but it's just saying you go to war. Nietzsche, of course, challenging the idea of, coming up with the idea of the Übermensch, Hitler trying to essentially make that happen. And by the time they're going into the mid-1940s, when the war is over, The empire is no longer very interested in those lands out there. So they're beginning to abandon and come back home. So there's been costly, the war's been costly for every country involved.
Yes.
So if you're out there, the country doesn't think much about you. You're beginning to have significant independence. 1947, the Indian-Pakistani border is drawn. You have about 90 countries in the world at this point, give or take. And so it becomes costly to now maintain these empires out there. Now you've lost millions of people back at home. There is a demand for reconstruction. So empires begin to look, colonies begin to look very, very unappealing from across all standpoints, diplomatically, in terms of commerce, in terms of national interest for all these empires. So they begin to cut back and pull back. And so, and Black people had, of course, fought alongside these people in French Algeria, in Tanganyika, in India, across, in Europe. And they could tell, these people are just cowards, they bleed, they die. Yeah, we can see they're just human. And so going into the mid-40s now, you begin to see that kind of agitation. The drum, the drums are beating now right closer home. The colonial power is beginning to have a harder time keeping, the empire in check because the Mau Maus are here, the Kenya Land Defense Force, KLDF, is here. And so it's how do you, there are enough educated people, they went out there, they learned your language during the war, they're coming back, they dress like you, they're like, I do not understand why I have to report to you. But what's interesting that comes up economically at that point is that, and I think Professor Arne has mentioned it, and I think they actually, because the first time we have official economic statistics in Kenya is around 1915, thereabout, give or take. So by 1950, about 50% of the economy is Black, the other 50% is white. So it's almost like a 50-50. But that can be fooling because 50 means 50% for what, 5,000-10,000 settlers, versus another 50% for, by this point, the population of Africans about 4-point-something, going 5 million. So it's, on paper, it looks like half-half, but then when you start to break it down, you realize the cash economy has eaten significantly into the indigenous economy. But also remember, there's the Chiefs Act of 1937, where they would come and seize your cows and seize this if you didn't pay. And so a lot of that resources that are collected are either shipped abroad or they're used to develop the White Islands, their neighborhoods, the places they exist. So they get all the best of everything. And despite you paying taxes, you get not that much anyway. We begin the segregation of places like Nairobi, which of course escalates when you go into the 1950s with the Operation Anvil against the Mau Mau. So the economy is 50-50, but it's not 50-50 in terms of, it's that your average white person is having 40-50 times as much, resources as the Black person within the same economy. Yeah. So by the tail end of the 1940s going into the 1950s, that's what you're dealing with. Now you get to 1950, you have the critical dynamics is Sir Evelyn Baring declaring state of emergency, right? Yes. Then the Swinnerton plan comes into place because you remember 10 years ago, they hired 200,000 Africans extra, not even the ones who are already working there. So the labor market has expanded significantly in terms of skill, in terms of exposure of the people, and you need to find a way to absorb these people. So part of the safety valve is the Swinnerton plan, trying to get people into this agricultural policy and to be able to produce both for empire, but also to keep them busy. They're back from war, they're anxious, they're restless. They know what upward mobility looks like. They've enjoyed the fruits of modernity, so you have to offer them something. Yeah.
That's a bit a little depressing because the problem is this model of upward mobility. That's what's eating the whole world now. Because anyway, maybe we can come to that later. So did Europe okay, there are two things I've heard about how empires were considering the colonies. One is that that America was the one that was now starting to get nervous about so many colonies uprising because of the fear of the spread of communism. So I wanted to ask, after the war, did the European powers anticipate remaining in Africa, or what were they thinking going forward?
One of the interesting things that happens immediately after the war, of course, it's framed as the West won, the storming of the Normandy. But I mean, the Soviet Union played a significant role in weakening the Reich, and what happens is that going into now the post-war reconstruction models, Europe has undergone massive infrastructure damage, significant loss of lives. So George Marshall, the American secretary, comes up with the idea of the Marshall Plan, provide all the incentive to Europe, resources, finances, and all these, both economic and material, to help the reconstruction of Europe. But of course, that clearly makes them it makes them essentially the leaders of Europe, despite being across the ocean, So this is where the American ascendancy begins. And now they're building themselves up, and because a significant portion of the continental Europe can no longer maintain their overseas empire. They begin to take over some of that, but then they don't take it over through the colonialism as it were. What they do is they begin to come up with, so in the 1940s is when we come up with the Bretton Woods system.
Yes.
So Bretton Woods system comes up in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire. There are about 91 countries in the world by the time Bretton Woods is coming up. About 44, 45 of them, that must have been somewhere in July of 1945, signed up for the creation of the Bretton Woods system. And I think what's interesting about that is the fact that now you're saying you'll peg your currencies on the dollar, on the gold reserves rather, as a trading model. So your currency is pegged to the gold reserves that you have. And the other aspects of the other institutions that are developed under Bretton Woods. So the Bretton Woods wasn't just one or two organizations, it was an entire system of thought that was essentially supposed to pull the world out of that damage that World War II had wrought basically around the world. And so what's interesting is you have part of people who came up with that is people like what they call the Truman Doctrine, and the impact on the world and the place he thought was the place of America in the emerging world. I mean, I think I'd mentioned earlier, there's a book called The Wise Men, The Six Friends and the World They Created by Walter Isaacson. People like Dean Acheson, people like Herman, and I mean, these were undersecretaries of war, undersecretary of trade within the American system. And they begin to see a new way of essentially neo-colonialism, a new neoliberal order you begin to put in place where instead of going and taking people's lands, you establish institutions, and then these people are tied up to these institutions, but you are the custodian of this institution. So you move away from the white islands model to white capital model. Yeah.
So, okay, I hope it's okay if we just go into details on the Truman Doctrine and the Marshall Plan. How were these? Okay, first of all, what was the logic behind it? Was it that they are saying America has to be in control and this is how we do it, or what? And then just go into the details. How are they supposed to work and for who?
Essentially, you're going into this, of course, the ascendancy of the American empire, what they call Pax Americana, begins at this point. So the British, the French, the Germans, they're all caught up in this continental Europe decline. They're trying to clean up their places. They bombed out their cities. Americans are fairly fine. I mean, it was a geographical blessing. They were across the continent, the ocean. So they didn't take, apart from, say, Pearl Harbor, they didn't take much damage from it. So they're the ones with the money. They're the ones who come out of this thing with the money, with the troops, with the resources. and they also want a share of the global empire, colonial empire, so to speak. But they don't want to do your boots on the ground, racial dynamic that's going on. So you do it, but through institutions. So which institutions can you establish? You begin to establish these institutions that you're creating a world system with you at the center of it. So it's both for diplomacy, for foreign policy, for commerce and trade. Essentially, you wonder that there's a new world emerging, and you want to make sure that that world is essentially centered around institutions that you are in charge of or you are in control of, such that you get to win the spoils of war, even if you're not the one who entirely won. Yeah.
That makes sense about why the education system is the way it is. It's training people to sort of work in this world order, basically.
Yeah, it's interesting because then a lot of these countries need loans. You're giving them through the Marshall Plan. A lot of these countries need resources. They're paying homage to you. You're building all these bilateral and international institutions. They're domiciled in your country. And since you came out ahead of this, you get the spoils of war, and the rest of the countries need loans. They're coming to you. They need currency to trade. Remember, just to go a bit further back, in 1914 is when we had what they called the Mombasa Currency Board, which was like the precursor to CBK. And then we had the East African Currency Board, which was based in London. And then now you're building up towards the creation of a locally based, financial and regulatory institutions. You're going to need money to rebuild. You're going to need money to do ABC. You're going to need resources for this. If you're trading with foreign countries, you're going to need some medium of exchange. And so the cash economy expands, and there's a lot of resources moving around at this point. But then, the levers that are moving those resources, in the hands of particular interests and particular nations and particular empires. So, it was a good time for them. Not sure about the rest of,
parasites. Basically, they took over the world when it was at its weakest and never allowed it to grow, basically, or rather to grow only on American terms, basically.
Yeah, and one of the things that comes up further down the road is through the 1960s, that system works for them for maybe about 20 years. By the time they're getting to the 1960s, the dollar is going through a lot of volatility. It's straining, basically. So Americans decide, we are going to ditch this Bretton Woods system. We're going to essentially establish to cut ties between the dollar and the gold reserves. So in 1971 is when we had the oil shock. 72 is when they declare that, just tell the world we are done with pegging our dollar on the gold reserves, and that's the point where officially the Bretton Woods system dies. But remember, all the institutions it's created are still, they stay intact. But now the core aspect of it, which was pegging the dollar on, or rather currencies on the gold reserves, ends at that point. And so from that point on, then the dollar begins its ascendancy towards, becoming the world essentially primary stable currency.
Okay, yeah. For us non-economists, explain how currency works. You're talking of being pegged to. What does that mean? So, okay, I just go from the basics of what is currency, and then now go up to being pegged on the dollar or on gold.
The thing with the resources is that you need to trade. You need to trade with people in other countries. You need to trade, and you don't use the same kind of currency. So essentially, currency is a medium of exchange. It's simply a store of value. It's a measure of value. And we've had different types of currencies. At some point, people use salt, the cowrie shell. It's
cows.
Yeah. So, but then over time, you begin to create these coins as a representative of that values. Then it becomes they're easier to carry around. It's easier to peg a particular value on it. And so, that explains how the cash economy grows. But then when you need to trade with other countries, you need a particular currency with which you can then say, our value relative to this one, and our value relative, and your value of your currency relative to this particular currency. This is the value, and so when we both have this particular currency, we can trade without all the modalities and the complications of having to use your currency or mine, subject, of course, to availability, which this stable currency offers. But then also, what's interesting is also relative to the volume of trade, because they've come out of the World War. They are the ones with the money bags, so it becomes easier for them to take a significant portion of the world trade. So even availability of their currency out there, the stability of it within the trading markets is much higher than a lot of these other countries that are barely. Remember, majority of these independence happens post 45 to, like, say, around 1965. So a lot of these countries don't even have a particular stable currency that they can use within their countries. So it's easier to either use your currency, a basket of currencies, your particular currency, adopt the currency of another country, in this case, say the dollar, or a multiplicity of that. So the dollar became easier to peg a lot of the trade. And when you do that, of course, its value grows as a share of the global, exchange of currencies. And essentially it takes a lead on that. So it's what you use as a measure of value and its percentage in terms of global volume of trade. And with that, of course, comes the security built into it, how it is, backed back at home. Of course, a bit with even some sort of the military might also feeding into that, because you're able to keep it safe. I mean, is it the FBI who are the custodians of the dollar? So issues of counterfeit are able to be taken care of. So it comes with a certain level of convenience, and I think the world doesn't mind it. So it grows and grows and grows and grows out of that. Yeah.
But people were getting tired in the 70s and 80s of America interfering in their economies. So they had to put a lot of military might to protect that dominance of the currency, didn't they?
And generally across, I mean, it was the empire of the second half of that century. So it's military might, it's economic might, it's all the intellectual work that went into it. It was innovation, and all these sort of the ability to project power globally across, through science, and a bit on technology, a bit on the military, and of course the volume of trade. I mean, it was insane. At some point, it was almost 25% of pretty much the global economy. That's huge. Many times over the size of even the second to 10th economy. So by that measure alone, then the level of might they have, and of course through direct interaction with other countries globally, but also interestingly through the institutions. Remember, Bretton Woods as a system collapsed, but the institutions around it stuck around. They're still offering cash to governments. They're still providing all these so-called development loans. And I mean, lately you heard here in Kenya, we talk a lot about World Bank and IMF. So those are some of the legacies of the Bretton Woods system that survived, that change from the gold reserves to essentially severing the pegging of currencies to the dollar reserve system. So they're still around, and then that provided them with a significant capacity to project power directly or indirectly to a lot of countries that actually, went with a begging bowl, asking for loans, asking for grants, asking for development money, and all that. Yeah.
Yes. So what are IMF and World Bank? What are they? Who are they? Where did they come from? And why are they still called Bretton Woods if you're saying the system collapsed?
I mean, it's the most famous name they're known for. So I think nobody would want to challenge it as a brand. Still has heritage, even if it sort of ended in the 1970s, because the system, I shouldn't even say ended. I think it morphed in a sense. So some aspects of it died out. Some aspects of it stuck around. So these are international institutions who mandated themselves to provision of loan systems, helping countries out here, or at least working within some countries, especially when they want loans, they want help in their countries, when they're having issues with inflation in their countries, when they're low on currency reserves for trading. A lot of countries literally run to them. So it is pretty much the only system that exists within the global sort of financial system for that. And of course, it has the backing of the Western countries, so they're able to, get the money to be able to lend out to mostly countries in the global South, so to speak. So that's how they've been able to stick around. Yeah.
Are they
so they work
banks?
on the financial regulations, and in a sense, the institutions that have the banking arm, they have significant arms around the wider scope of economic, trade regulations, advisory, direct loans provision, and all those sort of financial risk assessments. So they cover, they have all these sort of arms within the global financial architecture in which now they're able to work on these advisory, loan provisions, regulations, and yeah.
So if I refuse, if country A refuses to follow the IMF conditionalities, what people have been saying is that the US government comes for you. Is that true? Or what happens if you decide, not in terms of the abstract of, they'll say this, but fundamentally, what happens if an economy was to say, no, we are not following your conditions?
It's actually important to have, and I think that comes to the question of how we are running our economy. If we stay out of debt, then we don't need them. And it's what partly the mid-2000s we did it. You balance your budgets, you pay off your loans, you ensure your balance of trade is working, you ensure your current accounts in terms of the cash flow in and out of the country is working, you create a stable macroeconomic environment in the country where your people's productivity is being rewarded, then you don't need any of these loans. But then you go into like the 2010s and what we did under President Uhuru Kenyatta, where you're borrowing over 4% on a debt to GDP ratio over successive years. Eventually that becomes too much to pay, because unless you're putting it into productive use, and generally within public finance, it's not advisable. But then he did that over multiple successive years. We breached a lot of public finance mechanisms of check and control. So, by the end of it, we are in the red, and, they come in town and say, we'll give you money. So, if we keep our books in order, it's the only way you keep these institutions and systems out. But if we go fumbling like we did, then we find ourselves with an 11-point-something trillion debt in a country's economies, maybe 12-13 trillion. Then we are, that's trouble. You don't have. Even the scripture say, the borrower is a slave to the lender. It's yeah.
So, but you see, the management of an economy is the political part. And when you have a country where people think politics is the president, I'm hearing is what we did during the Uhuru years is we returned to imperial presidency, where the president did what he wanted, even though we had a constitution that should have blocked him from doing it. He basically did what he wanted, broke all the prudent economic policies. And what is worse, the people I'm interested in are the civil servants who facilitated this nonsense. How dare they? In fact, we should also out them. It's not just the MPs. We need to talk about who was in position and why did they say anything? Or am I being a bit moralistic here, too moralistic?
No, it's one of the things that, even within economic spaces, people were saying whoever was going to take over the presidency was going to inherit a broke country. By the time we were on the last quarter of Uhuru's regime, all the indicators were blinking red, and
so who are these economists who are facilitating him and they didn't tell him?
So what
he appointed people.
Yes, he did. And one of the things whoever was coming into power should have done was, it's something we've had Ndi say, Ruto say, and also on the other side, Baba say, is whoever was coming into power should have done two things immediately: a public debt audit, get the former controller of budget, the current one, the auditor general, and then, get someone from the economic advisory team, and of course, representative from the respective agencies within the finance ministry, create get all the sort of their inputs into these debt issues, and then get a public debt audit report. When was this money borrowed? What were the financial mechanism within which they were borrowed? Does it follow our financial rules? Where did this money go? Essentially, one of the things they should have done is a public debt audit. Who borrowed, where, when, what was that money used for? Did it do the job it did? If it didn't, where is that money? Number two, there was a place to do a state capture report. What the kind of dynamics, because there was a significant part of that. And I mean, even within the civil society, I think there was a couple of seminars talking about the state capture issue. So those were the two ways that should have, the two things that should have been instituted immediately. The president came into power. None of them were done, and now it's coming back to haunt him. So a state capture report and a public debt audit report would have put us at a very, very good place, because even if you don't get back all that money, at least you'd know where it was wasted and what can be redeemed at this point, who needs to be prosecuted, and where does the country go from here. Yeah.
Because, okay, like for example, if we are getting a loan, who signs it? Is it the president? Is it the CS Treasury? Is it the head of central bank? Who is signing these documents? And who is negotiating on Kenya's behalf to get these loans?
I mean, of course, all those institutions are usually, it's never a single person out there. All these institutions, the Treasury, the central bank, and, they're always working, and all the subcommittees in there, they're always working together, because the government is always in the financial market. Is it every Thursday or Friday to be able to acquire, currency for trade, and to be able to get loans if, they need to finance something. So it's a committee, and there's a process to it. There are checks and controls and mechanisms with this thing. So the moment you look at this kind of debt bunch, the debt addiction that we went into, then that means either these committees and the respective desks assigned to be able to work through the financial control systems to do their job, or they were complicit. But the mechanism is there, and to be fair, we have one of the most robust financial mechanisms of checks and control. It's just, which also makes it easier to go and ask, who signed this, who didn't sign this, did this pass through your desk, how was this approved? You remember towards the very end of Uhuru's regime, where the controller of budget was basically saying she refused to sign on to some of those expenditures, and she got harassed, carried around, and they used with the Subarus and driven around. There was a whole lot of intimidation. So that tells you it came from essentially the highest office in the land at that point.
Executive.
Yeah, because the mechanisms of checks and controls are there. They're supposed to fix this. If they didn't, it's very easy to trace back and say which loan, where, when, who signed up. This is the mechanism and the process. Was it followed or not? Now, who's paying for this? Yeah.
So we basically had a fox in the chicken house since 2013.
Yeah.
Okay, let's go back. We'll come back to that. So we've talked about this, the Second World War, what happened afterwards. Okay, independence times, now the 60s. Many countries are getting independence. The US is undergoing the civil rights movement. What was the thinking of empire, the imperial financial control people? What were they thinking at that time?
I mean, one of the interesting things is, of course, you're having all these transitions from, the white central bank governors to black ones, all this. So you're having this transition away from the white aristocracy to the black aristocracy. So they're training people to take over this in the police service. You used to have all these white governors, Nairobi, white mayors from the colonial infrastructure. And so there's a lot of transitions going on at that point. And what's interesting is that throughout the 60s, the Kenyan economy grew quite impressively throughout the decade and well into the 70s. We had, and part of it is that, of course, the transitions that we were having. There was enough land to till. There was a lot of trade to be had. You had a lot of wealth transfer, so to speak, when the local, the natives were taking over some of these jobs within the state machinery. But generally, our economic fundamentals were very, very, fairly impressive throughout the 70s and throughout the 60s and the 70s. Even though the political dynamics, of course, there was a whole bunch of stuff going on over there. But essentially, on aggregate, the economy was doing quite a significant level of distribution of resources, of income, wealth, and opportunity within the country. Yeah.
Was IMF in our business at that point?
They come back, I think, around 1980.
When Kenya starts to get broke.
Yeah, I mean, in fact, 80, 81, 82, the economy grew. I think the trouble now starts properly in 83. But by 1980, we were beginning to have those, what they're called, the sectoral adjustment programs, where such particular sectors were beginning to make concessions to international financial systems, negotiating for resources. So it was in the economy, but it was sectoral, not structural. So at least called sectoral, So sectoral adjustments systems. But then as it progresses, it begins to eat into it starts taking on the public systems, the public social services. That's when now you're dealing with what they call the structural adjustment program. And at this point throughout the 80s, the economy goes down to an average of about 4%, which is half of what it was in the 60s in terms of year-on-year growth. It was around 4%, give or take. In the 90s, it drops again by half to about 2%, with a bit of negative growth here and there, especially I think around 93. Yeah. So
okay,
it was a decline. Yeah, it was a decline from 8% to like about 5-6% in the 70s to about 4% in the 80s to about 2% in the 90s. So by the time we're getting into the 90s, we were in trouble, basically. We had signed up to these these programs, and there was a lot of trouble. And I mean, we've listened to some of the people, especially Kenyans, who sat on those tables to negotiate those loans. And it's those stories would be funny if they were not so tragic, but by then we were already in the red. Yeah.
Okay. Before we get there, sorry, I skipped 1952. What did the Mau Mau War do in terms of the political economy, and how did that lead to the decisions that were made as we entered into independence?
I mean, what's interesting is, of course, you have the Mau Mau War, the Mau Mau ramp up their fights, the Kenya Land Defense Force. It's getting increasingly costly. So Evelyn Berang declares a state of emergency. And then, of course, now you essentially have a significant insurgency going on within your economy. And of course, that it has an impact because you're partly also creating a securitized kind of economy, because you have to keep tabs on it. You have to monitor who's coming into the city, who's leaving. You have to put quite a significant budget or amount of your resources into maintaining the kind of security infrastructure that you feel will keep you safe. And then you create another safety valve, which is the Soinaton Plan, as an aggressive agricultural policy to try and, so the agricultural sector grows significantly. Because
what does the plan do?
I mean, interestingly, it creates, number one, it creates a certain level of a landed middle class locally. But also
it says that now Africans can own land, or what?
Yeah, you can grow some of those cash crops, which for the most part kept away from. But then what's also interesting is that in as much as you're able to do that, still the old mechanisms are still around in terms of sale. All these marketing boards are now coming up as part of, as a part of that agricultural policy, because it's mostly cash crops. Of course, it has a cultural dynamic to it, which is, and it's still a problem you see now in some parts of Kenya, where you do massive cash crops, you begin to go slow on food crops. So people have all these tea farms and this, but then you begin to see a certain kind of hidden poverty,
Yes.
Yeah, because if you're growing sugarcane and it takes 18 months, you also need to have your skuma and the things you're eating every other day. Yeah. So that becomes a challenge on the food side of things. But on the commercial side of things, and as an agricultural policy, it definitely creates a significant expansion within the economy, especially the agricultural sector portion of the economy. Yeah.
These marketing boards, because they have their names have come up, what do they do? SCG tea auction, what? Because I've heard people complaining about them.
So I mean, in a sense, it becomes like an end-to-end provision of agricultural inputs. Providing farmers with all these farming techniques, agricultural inputs in terms of machinery, all these pest control inputs. When they harvest, they provide them with the market, with the auctions, or direct sell to markets both locally and abroad. So it was sort of an end-to-end system to help to work at least with farmers, essentially from inputs to not just outputs, but the sale of the outputs in the market. And of course, when you go into the 90s, there's a whole bunch of trouble, some of them collapsing, managerial issues that come into there. But essentially, they were a big part of augmenting the Swinnerton agricultural policy plan. Yeah.
Because that's what I wanted to observe. I feel like you're talking about how it's supposed to work, how the system is supposed to work, but farmers are not being paid. Their pockets are still struggling. So where is the disconnect? Is it, and then you see some farmers getting extremely wealthy and starting to be barons in Kenya, Kenyan barons. Then there's also the issue of inequality. Some crops are favored over others. So like when you look at coffee in Kisumu and those areas, it wasn't getting the kind of support that coffee was getting in Central. So where is the deficit? Because I don't want a moral answer, which is what Kenyans do. Oh, they were corrupt, they were bad people, they didn't love their country. What's the structural or philosophical, ideological problem that is causing this dissonance between what institutions say they want to do and the way the people in charge of them are running them?
I mean, in a sense, there is, I mean, of course, there's managerial dynamics and the skill sets needed to run some of these institutions. Number one. Number two, they were not immune to political interference. The big bosses will always swing by in some of them and, want a cut or want some kickbacks out of here and there. Number three, also part of it is the fact that they were established. Remember, the Swinnerton plan was a safety valve also. It was, we've come from the 40s, these people, I mean, they fought with us out there. We hired almost 200,000-300,000 extra in the last decade. They have the skills, they know this thing. How do we keep them from agitating? Remember, we've declared a state of emergency. So how do we pacify these people and slowly, but also adopt them into the cash economy and the colonial modernity, but within frameworks that we have a handle on and we have control over. So within all those managerial issues, political interference, and the logic why they are set up, and at least trying to be run, you definitely are going to run into trouble, to get into trouble with fiscal accountability, who benefits, which gets favored and what, and all these dynamics. So eventually, some of them begin to get into headwinds with that, and quite a number actually didn't survive. Yeah.
Some of the people who are close to the president at independence, they would take loans and they would be surprised when they are being asked to pay them back. As in, I don't know. In fact, when my mom in love told me that story, I was like, how does that happen?
But it's happened before. I mean, how did the first Kenya's official Mercedes was bought? Did we pay for it? I don't think so. I mean, that's like one of the biggest corruption scandals. Actually one among the first corruption scandals we had in the country.
Was there an inbuilt ideology, or I don't know? I don't understand it. I know I should, but I don't.
Was there the colonial? Yeah, I mean, the
Is it
same way the
because-
white people come and take land, this one will take the car without paying. See, the masters are taking land without paying. It's
Oh.
the logic of acquisition at this point. It's, you
So
know,
even the settlers and the colonialists did the same thing. This thing of I'm acquiring because I can, and I mean,
yeah. And if you are their black handlers or consigliers, I mean, why not? Yeah, because there are enough of those stories throughout the 60s and the 70s of, you know, you'd walk into a facility, take a loan, not pay, you'd go order a car, you know the names, you know, and you're like, oh, I was supposed to return it, or I was supposed to pay, you know. So it's quite prevalent within those within
or you
certain
see
sectors.
land and you say, go write a title deed, and that's it.
Yeah, you know, those jokes we tell that walk until you get tired, then put a mark there, and that's your your land. It's that logic was there.
Wow. So I think it's kind of still there in a sense.
It's never gone away, you know. And
Yes.
and I remember there's a question you asked me about why we talk a lot about industrialization. We really
Yes.
don't. The question of productivity. It goes back to those 1890s when we set up the Imperial British East Africa. In a sense, we built an extractive system, you know. So it's not an industrial system with a productivity model and logic at the heart of it. It's not generative, it's extractive. So when you talk about
when you're helping the farmers, it's not for them, it's for you. It's to extract
it
from
first
them.
it was for empire, then now it's for you because you've taken over the levers and structures of the system. So if you have a handle on it, then it becomes about you. So it was, in a sense, it's not industrialization as much as it's extraction, you know, with a bit of productivity. And yeah, so because it does not, it works with that old logic of extraction. You even see it play out again and again and again into, you know, history. So the people who are doing the actual labor productivity are looking at this system, and then the people who sort of control the levers of it are looking at it as this. It's another cash cow. It's another money box. It's another place to go and grab a few million shillings or a few billion shillings. So that's where the industrialization dynamics come, because the extractive bit takes away. The industrial bit is supposed to be generative, and as we know with our elites, they're barely ever that creative. You know, they're not that generative. Yeah.
So basically, there's an philosophical, ideological problem, so that the leaders, they end up still extracting from the economy, even though on the ground people are producing. The handlers are still not, they've not started in their minds. They are not, it's not about production, it's about getting rich.
One of the problems that we face, and this problem Ruto faces and he doesn't even realize is because this system is built to be necessarily corrupt, you know, at least the first republic. So the first president had land to, you know, he could play around with the land for himself and his cronies, you know, and a bit of the cash from the old coffers in the 50s going into the 60s. The second president had a bit of land, but then there were the parastatals and the marketing boards to run down. You know, there was a place he could eat. The third president, because the economy grew quite a bit through the 2000s and the political freedoms, he had taxes. And so you look at the Anglo-leasing and all that, it was at the tax level of theft. The fourth president comes in and there's nothing left to steal, so he goes into debt. So that's the logic. Everyone has the extractive model as a president. But now you see Ruto comes in, he does not realize that there's nothing to steal, but the old logic is still here. So it becomes like, what would you call it? Like something that hounds him, you know, like have to be stealing. The logic of power in these countries that have to be extractive and necessarily corrupt. But what is there to steal? If it's debt, it's gone. If it's land, there isn't much around. So what you do, you start coming up with funny ideas like the housing levy and the sheaf. You have to steal. It's like an addiction, you know, to that system. So he doesn't realize that he's overseeing a very old logic that has run its course. And that's why he keeps running into all this trouble with the Kenyans. Because, you know, he's supposed to be stealing, but what is there to steal, you know?
Hey, let me just pause there because, gosh, Hey. But it's not only him who doesn't understand. It's not only him.
Yeah, because it's the system. It's not even a him problem. It's just that now he's the visible guy there, and now he has to take flag for it. It's the system is built for that. But then, because there's nothing to steal, he does not know where to go with this. So he wants to send Kenyans abroad to so they can bring him data, talking about this gig economy. You can tell he's in the wind, but he doesn't realize it's not a him problem. His only problem is that he has refused to understand that old logic, no longer has a way to, actualize itself within the current framework of where Kenya is, with all this debt, and it's a hyper-visible society, and, you can't steal like the way you do 10, 20, 50 years ago with very, and suppress it from the media. People know in real time.
Hey, that one will take me time to process, huh? I mean, hey, that's good. So maybe before we get to now, I think you've kind of covered the question of what happened to the economy since 2007, not 2007, 2002 when Kibaki took over. Maybe is there any detail you could add on to, because you've said, Kibaki, it was the scandals, then Uhuru, it was the loans. But what else was happening economically at that time over the two presidencies?
One of the interesting things, and I think I mentioned before, is political freedom is a precursor to economic freedom. What's interesting about the Kibaki era is that the poor did not benefit, at least not directly. Inflation was almost 20-something, almost 30%. So they are not making as much value from their incomes. But because there's generally quite a bit of liquidity in the market, people generally benefited from that. But then you go into early 2010s. In fact, if you look at the Afrobarometer report, in 2014, poverty begins to go up again in the country, which had been in decline from as far back as 1999 or thereabout. So in a sense, you have the lower clusters are not, making any, headway in terms of the resource allocations. But then the economy looks like it's generally on an upward trajectory.
It's like a mathri. It's like a mathri, how it's busy, moving, but it's really not getting closer to the destination. Yeah. It's just taking these panya routes and whatever, but you're taking almost the same time to get to where you want to go.
Yeah, and it creates a lot of challenges for the society, because by the time then you've created an expectations that people should want more, that, you're growing the banking sector, higher education is growing, so you're educating all these people. So FSD is telling you the 20 to 48-year-olds are, on aggregate, much better educated. And with education comes expectations, and, in terms of jobs and what kind of jobs they're willing to take. But then you haven't created a mechanism to keep that going. So by the time you're going into, if you would call it Uhurunomics, by the third quarter of 2014, you begin to go into these kinds of breach of financial, essentially the kind of fiscal discipline that, we try to maintain for a while. There's the restless cluster. So what do? A year later, you begin to have, You begin to have the clampdown on education system, because you're looking at the problem you're creating in the economy, but you don't have a solution for it. So you say the problem is you're producing too many graduates. So you begin to throttle the education system, because your logic or your manifestation of the old logic of the necessarily corrupt system is dead. And it's not a debt that you're getting into for any generative purposes. You're building all these two shiny toys for yourself. You're putting in budgeted corruption. So you're trying to keep people behind. What do? You start messing with the education system. But remember, you're boating the barn when the horse is gone. You've been educating these people since 98, 99. You already have a pool or a cluster that, you can't kick them out. So in fact, if you were to be, to speak into that, I would say that's the time the tyranny of the 5% technically died. I mean, they've tried to prop it up, but by the time you get into like, early to mid 2010s, that tyranny of 5% is no longer sustainable, both within itself in terms of the number of people it's generated within the elite cluster, but this whole new pool of, educated masses that you have in the society, that you need to be able, number one, to rejig the labor market to enable these people to find work, but also fix the economy to ensure that resources are moving in such a way that these people can be productive. And I don't think they have, or they had, in a sense, planned for that. So from there, it's now trouble up to where we are. It's just successive problems. You throttle this, you borrow more, you kick the can down the road, you take, Eurobond as a commercial loan from the investors in the financial market. You misappropriate that, you take Eurobond too, you misappropriate that, you come up with all these funny projects. The controller of budget tells you, the auditor general tells you, half of the things that have been funded, I can't tell even what they're funded. And this is the auditor general of the country. That's alarming. And Ouko and currently. So it's, from there, we've been on this sort of a downward spiral in terms of what we do in public management and economic resources. But the elites haven't figured out that the system they're living in died long ago. What they're seeing right now is just the embers and the echo from that.
That requires Vasco da Gama. If you don't have imagination and you have no respect for history, you are not going to see it. I don't see how you can see that problem, because what the arts and humanities does is for you to conceptualize problems that are not tangible. And to me, what I'm hearing you say is that we have an idea problem in terms of managing our economy. The other thing I wanted to ask, is it possible, because this is a theory I've had, is it possible that also the corruption has increased because now there are more people to co-opt and keep quiet? So unlike pre-2007 maybe, or pre-2000, it's just a few families. But now that you have educated all these people, if you don't want them to come to overthrow you through popular revolt, you have to co-opt them into the system. And that's why this thing of policy becomes so attractive to the middle class. I really hate it. Where if something is not working, then you're told, oh, let's do policy. Let's have a workshop, write a policy and propose to the government. So it gives you an illusion that you're doing something, but really you're not doing. All you're doing is wasting your energy and time writing documents for the government, which the government will not implement. I don't know.
The death by bureaucracy and managerialism. It's it's interesting because even that definitely eventually, I mean, the starting point of it, of course, goes back to the fact that there are a lot of people who couldn't fit in the system in the first place, mainly for political reasons. So the consulting, the gig economy, this was a way of people who, and by the time you're beginning to talk gig economy policy workshops, you're already realizing that your 5% no longer fit there. They become 7%, but your logic is still at the idea of the privileged minority. So it was a way to keep all these people in there. But even that eventually ran its course. So at this point, anything short of a major overhaul of the logic of the state in this country will not suffice. Even those, gigs and consultancies no longer exist as much. And when I think about it, it was the Ndegwa Commission, and then, which opened that floodgates. You could invest in private businesses, the politicians and the bureaucracy. But then they became the same people. Instead of establishing businesses, they built all these kiosks to be able to apply for tenders back in government. So it was a circular system of absurdity, But then now you think about it right now, there's a similar bill coming up recently that wants to do the same, opening up, the regime to be able to, the bureaucrats within the regime to be able to trade with the state, which is basically, conflict of interest. So it's gone a full cycle. It is, just circling the wagons again and again. And it's unfortunate because the country then loses critical time to be able to revisit some of these ideas and say, when where are the spaces where we can do generative growth? Where do we, if young people are here and they're restless, why don't we develop the North and open up? I mean, if you spend, say, 40 billion shillings opening up the North, some of those 10, 20 towns up in the North, put electricity, water, the basic social services. Young people are creative in this country, then they're very industrious. They'll find a way to make it there. But when the system is still so beholden to the central reality of, money has to be in Nairobi, it has to be here, it creates a problem for itself, because then that makes it easier to steal, because the money is in one particular pool, and that works for them when it comes to stealing, but it doesn't. That's the same problem we try to solve with the devolution. It's part of why we set up these institutions out there away from the center. It's part of how we ended up fighting in 2007, because when everything is at the center, everybody's looking at the center. Then it becomes a pressure valve, and when it does that, then it becomes very volatile, because everybody begins to realize that if you're not at the center or have a tentacle in the center, then it's a matter of life and death. And eventually people get to war again. So if they keep this reconsolidation that's going on, the uselessness and absurdity of these bureaucrats is interesting, because you pull those resources to the center, then you offer trinkets out there. People eventually begin to say, I also want to be in that space. You make it a very kind of a thing. And eventually it comes for you. I mean, the fact that you need resources on the ground, I mean, we can say a lot of things about devolution and some of these agencies that we pushed out there. And in fact, I think President William Ruto, was it on the first devolution conference when he became the president, said there are about 12 different or something functions that were still held by the central government that needed to be pushed out there to the flanks. Whether he followed up on it, I'll need to check on that promise tracker, whether he fulfilled that. But then that has always been this central privileged minority tyranny of the 5% has run out of own logic, has run out of the resources to use or to bribe, has run out of even the space to exist within the country, because the kind of scrutiny that's going on right now with the young people saying, what's going on with this in ministry, or what's going on with that in the ministry, with this key state agency, what's up? So they don't realize that when you centralize more within a hyper-visible world, you make yourself an easy target and a very visible, it's a hard to miss target. I don't know why they don't get it.
It's education. It's still the way we've been educated, because even the kinds of conversations I see in the Kenyan research, we are not even near. We are not even near understanding what the problem is. So I don't know. It's extremely bizarre to me. I wanted to mention the manifestos, because you see, when the politicians are campaigning, see, they have these grand ideas. I'll build this thing, I'll build this thing, I'll do this thing. Isn't that why? And those manifestos are signs that they have not understood. Because that's what Uhuru was giving us. He was giving us toys, concrete toys, and thinking that we were going to say, oh, wow, we have an expressway.
It does. I mean, it's the thing you've talked about before. They need visible to show people that they're working. That's why they wouldn't want to invest in long-term things that, successive projects that, will be completed long after they're no longer in power. They want it to be, I launched this, I put it together, and I did this. So but then there's also just the part that that's not the work, especially for an MP. If you were to single them out, the job is not to build all this and build. Your job is to and primarily regulate. And what they don't understand is the fact that, and I mentioned it before, political freedom precedes economic freedom. If they did a good job at oversight and legislation, they will never have had to go and pay money for classrooms and build toilets in the village, because the resources will get there if you do proper work in political regulation, political freedom, political progress, firm up the institutions and all the mechanisms of checks and balances and controls within the Kenyan state. Then resources will get to the ground. Kenyans are hardworking. Give them that kind of a facilitative environment, they will generate the resources. But then You throttle the system, and then you take some trinkets, and then you go to the ground and you build a toilet and write your name back there. I mean, it's such a shameless bunch. But then it's the absurdity of that kind of a system that they've decided this is how we are supposed to work. So
they did that with CBC, because what they did was to narrow the scope of what we can be educated in and say, oh, you must enter a pathway and stay there until whatever, like as if you are under the King of England. And then they say the equivalent of CDF is now to say, oh, but the parents are involved. Oh, we are talking about talent. So Kenyans think that the system has become more flexible, but actually it has become more rigid. It's just that the language with which it's being used to describe the system is that it has expanded. But actually, now that you describe CDF, it's the same way that CBC is doing. It's constricting education, but it's doing so with a language of expansion. Gaslighting, basically.
I mean, I look at Ruto and I'm hoping he'll take this as an opportunity. I mean, on bank on it, but I hope he'll take it as an opportunity to see that the fact that he's struggling with stickability, that the fact that he's not able to get his word through to Kenyans is because the old logic has, it's self-cannibalizing at this point, and he is partly a victim of it. This system is built to be necessarily extractive, but after 130, 140 years, there isn't much left to extract. So he's going to have to essentially rethink the entire resource question in this country, rethink the entire governance frameworks in this country. As far back as rethink the historical memory and how the logic of the state and the logic of humanity, or at the very least, creates an environment for people to be able to do that. Otherwise, even if he sticks around for the next 8 years, this is going to be him. He'll be jumping from one crisis into another and having to concoct a whole bunch of lies. And if he's prepared for that kind of pathological dance, then fine. But he needs to understand there's nothing different coming for him outside of this. In fact, or if anything, going into, so I'm looking at his economy, it's a 4 trillion budget he's coming up with. He wants to borrow around 980 billion, which is essentially $1 trillion. He needed to have, there's the finance bill and the appropriations bill. He needed to have sent back the appropriations bill to cut that budget to even 3 trillion shillings. He has about 662 billion shillings in unfunded liabilities. That's money to suppliers, money to, and paid, money government owes people, the pensions, and all that stuff. I mean, there's nothing right now. There's no magic wand he can wave over this country right now to pull him out of that. He's going to have to. I mean, the system essentially, as let's say, died in 07. That we looked at it at an operational level where it was 41+1 and all those narratives, the retaliations in Mathare and Naivasha. But at a foundational dynamic, that system concluded itself. Kibaki in the second half and Uhuru survived because, again, you remember we started by saying the problem with lagging indicators.
Yes.
But now for him, the indicators are here, and it's all visible that the logic of how the system built itself is gone. He's going to have to do that job, or at least create space for people to do that job. Short of which, this is going to be him. This will be his entire regime until 2027. And if he sticks around until wherever
if he lasts that long.
Yeah, but this is what he has to realize, that the old system is gone. He's the one who now, by virtue of history and circumstance, is the one who has to look in the mirror and say, you know what, maybe this is the time to redo the logic of this country. What is our history, actual histories? What's our logic on work? What's our logic on theology? What's our idea of human flourishing? What's our politics of land? And, how do we begin to rethink this extractive model? What is this necessity of corruption? How has it evolved over the last 130 years? And how do you begin to read it off from the system? His work is very foundational, very boring work. And if he doesn't, then he better sit there and be prepared for this bumpy ride, because, and it's the interesting bit about how they've gone about dealing with these protests where they're looking for leaders. And I keep saying, the only fuel this thing needs is even Kenyans on the ground can already feel that, this old system is gone. like there's such a demand for a new reality, a second republic, so to speak, or the actualization of a second republic in Kenya. People are looking at it. I mean, the economic pressure itself is enough fuel for people to keep harassing him until he leaves that office, whether now or wherever he thinks he'll leave. He can't survive. There's no alternative for him. I hope he gets it.
Hey, he does it. From what I know of our education system and my generation, I'll be very surprised if he gets it. But before now we get to the now, I wanted to ask about the ideas like jua kali, informal economy, even creative economy. I'm very suspicious of that idea. I feel like they are safety valves, which yeah, just explain what do these ideas do? Because, for example, there were some mechanics who met with Ogada, Juakali artisans, quote unquote. I don't even like that name, who told him, and yeah, even as we see that by now we would have been engineers and manufacturers, but we are still here. And yet, if you look at all the publications, policy documents, Juinini about Juakali, they are up there. And I feel even the creative economy is also a loop where you get the people feel that they're talking about artists and the economy, but I'm very suspicious of that narrative. So, are my suspicions correct, or what are those spaces about?
Yeah, we are experts in creating safety valves, and it's because the extractive economic model, and not just in the economics, even in politics and in many aspects of the Kenyan life and society, is that it's what you call the incremental reformist state. You know, the elites, you push the elites, they make minor concessions here and there, and where they can't create a safety valve, the certain clusters begin to emerge on the margins or on the shadows of what we consider their main economic model or system. And so, I mean, who came up with the main Juakali areas must have been the Wanjigi Senior. And
the one who was buried yesterday.
Yeah. And I mean, the system, of course, the system did not build to, so you have this formal, informal sort of within the economy. You say this is the formal sector, this is the kind of jobs it offers, this is economic logic, this is its connection to the banks. So I'll give you an example. The Kenyan banking history is very, very racist. So you have glint-lace banks back in the 1880s. And one of the interesting things they did was that they didn't say black people can't bank. They simply said, how much do you pay your average black person? Let's say it's 15 shillings. They said you need a minimum of 20 shillings to open a bank account. You know? So nobody's telling you don't open a bank account. They're simply saying if you earn 15 shillings and takes 20 shillings, then you find a place to keep your money. So from there, you begin to develop this sort of shadow financial system to be able to send money home. You give us some driver, back then the Riakanaus and the Akambas take this money home, all the way until the 60s and the 70s when we begin to develop the moneygrams and all that. So you exist on this because of the way the main system is discriminatory, both covertly and overtly. People begin to take their skills to this shadow economy and these shadow financial systems, and they begin to trade. And in a sense, they create an entire alternative reality of, the Juakali system. So even by the time they say the government structures and the regulatory frameworks are beginning to incorporate them within the economic, statistics, and to begin to include it as part of the wider economy and to recognize as economic activities, the necessity of its existence is a discrimination away from the cash economy and from the formal, financial system. And so it exists in the margins for people to be able to provide for themselves and eke a living. So it's an innovation of the masses around the tyranny of the privileged minority in how the economic model was. And one that develops enough, it develops its own nuance and language, and it's fairly creative. But then you see it also becomes a way to channel those who don't go through the funnel. You're going to say, okay, because it's a shadow system here anyway, so we don't need to create, something for you. So you do minimal reforms in that space, the incrementalist kind of reforms within the economy and the laws. But essentially, it's what exists in the margin when the formal infrastructure is not able to, or is deliberately designed not to provide the kind of resource distribution that would allow people to be able to essentially live a dignified life out there. So I mean, I understand the sentiments of those who say would have been engineers or something, but then we find ourselves having to take this path. It's probably one of the pathways of CBC, so to speak.
Yeah, that's where they want to push people so that they don't climb up the economy. That's why they're talking of talent, which is basically a way of saying, we don't want you in the economy, but we'll say that's how God made you. It has nothing to do with your learning.
There's something about that.
Yes.
There is this idea of elite overproduction.
Yes.
I've seen that. I've seen, the president's economic advisor really throw that around. And when you look at what they did in 2015, that throttling of the education system, it feeds into a problem we've always had, which is blame the education system for the economic problems. You have this skilled labor market that has very low labor absorption that underemploys people. You don't want to fix that, so you throttle the education system. And so you begin to say, I mean, let's look at sheer numbers. I mean, this is a country of 56 million people. The adults are about 35, 36 million. The number of people who have gone even that, university education is barely 1.1, 1.2 million. That's like 1 in 30 adults. Countries like, even if you were to take, let's say, the Singapore he likes comparing with, their numbers are 5 in 10 or 6 in 10. So there's no way you can say you have too many graduates here, honestly. It's, in fact, you have
Somebody told me the World Bank numbers that Kenya is quite low on the number of people who go to university. I was so shocked because the way we are told, it's like there are too many students.
I mean, if you have what, 35 million adults, and I mean, CUE published their report in that was 2018.
I think it was 18.
The numbers were around 900,000. Now, how many do we graduate in a year? It's probably 5,000-10,000. So I even know 1.2 million. I'm being generous. The current university population is what, 500,000? So even if you graduated all of them, you are still nowhere close to 2 million, and you have 35 million adults. I mean, those ratios don't add up. So it's a red herring. Somebody doesn't want to find the fact that you have to fix your economic resource question. You have to rejig your labor market. You have to work on the kind of technologies that you have to ensure that you're able to absorb more people into meaningful employment. So they come for you, people in the education system.
And we believe we are such foolish people. I'm so angry now, and I'm just so angry. I mean, that's stupidity. I'm sorry. It's just stupid. Anyway, creative economy. I'm so suspicious of that term, especially because they hated the arts. People started making money from the arts in ways the government had not imagined, especially because of the digital space. Now I've noticed that one of the things that annoys the government is these young people who are making money on their own and they haven't figured out how to tax them. I don't know whether I'm wrong to be very suspicious of that creative economy conversation of elites trying to get the artists into the mainstream.
I mean, for the purposes of, let's say, economic statistics and the computations, those are definitely numbers. If I was sitting on one of those desks, I would want to know. But then you realize young people are innovating their way there because you've not fixed the everyday economy. You have not provided. Well, I mean, it isn't that many who are making good resources in there. They are trying. They're living here and there. But then there is the part for them to just fix the economy. You cannot be talking about a gig economy and what you're offering is, I've looked at some of what's on offer. It's nowhere in terms of, there's so much labor violations in there. There's little money in terms of what's made. There isn't much facilitative regulations around how those people are able to, so it's almost like the policies that they come up with, the laws they come up with, the regulations are incidental to, oh, there's money here, we can, it's the same thing like what you did with the marketing boards, but now you do with the internet, oh, there's money here, let's go pick a few coins and see, let's add them into the tax bracket, which is okay. But when you realize that this evolution is partly just young people, on one end trying to, they can compete out there, then they'll go and try and make a living for themselves. But then there's much, much more the regime could have done in terms of creating facilitative spaces on this internet era. There's so much creativity in there. There's a lot of stuff people are doing. There's so many skills they're picking up there. There's so much network that they have access to over there. But when I look at it, this kind of very incidental, very not properly thought out ideas like Ajira, which was trying to get young people into, because of all that online writing and academic writing in Juja and in Thika Road by extension. You look at that and you realize that there are many regimes around the world that are very, very deliberate, that are very, very intentional in, number one, investing in that sort of the whole internet ecosystems and the online ecosystems and the wider creativity spaces, but also in ways that it's able to feed the local, the local creativity and skill. So you see, for example, I think it's Bangladeshi, and there are a couple of cities in India where if you want to develop technologies, there's the kind of technology that you can integrate into some of the things Joakali people have come up with. So you create this sort of very robust working system within your creative economies where you provide platforms, you provide financing, you provide trainings, you provide regulations that help, you're able to connect them with people doing similar things halfway around the world. There's a lot of opportunity there, but for the most part, it's incidental. It's almost like another example of Joakali, like this shadow thing that developed because the mainstream is not generating the kind of jobs, the quality of jobs, the diversity of jobs that can absorb these young people. They're doing well for themselves, but at what cost to what they could have actually been doing, both in terms of their productivity, but what they would have fed into skill-wise into the national economy. The government could do better.
Yeah, I mean, you've just talking of workshops. Hey, I've also become suspicious of them because there's this lady on TikTok who was saying these civil servants, they organize workshops for us. And then they come and tell us to be creative and self-employed, but them, they're not evidence of that. They've been working in the government for the last 40 years. So what do they know about creativity? And then now, of course, like today, people are talking about the per diems that they get. So the thing is, there's a way in which there's a performance of progressive listening to people, but the reality is different.
Isn't that how they killed the millennial revolution that we had started, which is eating them now? When we started, when we were agitating, when we were calling out some of these trends that we are seeing that were going to lead the country here, they picked and created an alternative system where you have your peers jumping from one workshop to another, and then they became the visible face of millennial progress. And so the rest of us sort of, figured that maybe this thing really doesn't have wings. But I mean, it was interesting. It was almost like a professional workshop attendance. You just jump from one to another, to a summit, to a capacity building, to a this, to a that. And eventually even they were discarded. And that's how the system works. So in a sense, it's death by bureaucracy, it's death by process, but interestingly, it's also death by workshops. Like we'll keep you here so nothing really gets done. And it takes away, I mean, of course, it has the per diems look nice, and it can be built into a whole career by itself. It's an entire industry or sector by itself. Yes. But it's interesting how it's when it becomes an alternative to actual creation, and it becomes an alternative. It's what the president is doing. You tell the president, fix the economy, create a conducive, thriving labor market. He says, I want dialogue.
By the way, even Hustler Fund, I said, no, that's not where the problem is. But I was told I don't know what I'm talking about. I'm not an economist. I was like, no, the issue is the structure of the economy. But
if they don't fix it right now, they're in trouble. The country has become too big. It's too interconnected. Young people are restless. They're asking questions. They can see what is happening elsewhere. Anybody in the highest levels of government right now who thinks they can, creativity or workshop or dialogue their way out of this is really insane at this point. There's no way out of this. You've exhausted the logic of the state, the tyranny of the 5%, the methods and models within which you can be able to effect the extractive, pulse of, executive existence, at least, and then within the elite existence. So nothing short of a rethink of this entire infrastructure is going to keep them there, unless they'll keep sending police to the streets. I hope they have money for tear gas for until 2027.
And different flavors,
Yeah.
That's one young person said. Okay, where do the venture, or what I call vulture capitalists come? The one who are keeping on telling Kenyans, do startups, do tech apps, do what, then they sponsor them and kill them off. Where do they fit in that system? Is it a coincidence, or it's just it's a logical product of the system?
I mean, what kind of a country have we built? Because we started so well, especially with that, with the ICT bill, the amendments we made in 2006, all the things we did that has enabled us to have this amazing internet and, very affordable mobile phones. We were on a good path. I mean, when you think about it, I don't know where we lost sight and we started this Tatu City, what is it called? The one in the Mombasa road, down the road.
Ponza.
Ponza City, where we started these, Silicon Savannah vibes. It's somewhere along the way, it got co-opted into the old logic of how the system works around here. I think that's where otherwise, on the overall, I think that was one of the biggest legacies we've had in the last 20 years. We've done some good work to that end. But again, if we do not fix what this, the model and the logic of this system of, and I mean, there's quite some impressive numbers when you look at the amount of money venture capitalists are willing to put in there. Then you look on the other side and you see the kind of output. A lot of them shut down without ever coming up with anything meaningful. A lot of them just pay bills and soon enough they're out. Then there's a new shiny toy in town. I don't know. It could be somebody has money to waste, or somebody is using resources to ensure you stay on this treadmill for long enough without any particular kind of output that is able to move everything forward. Because even amidst of all that sort of bureaucratic confusion, we're still doing, the young people doing some impressive stuff out here. But on the overall, still, the government, at the very least, we came up with some very good facilitative regulations well into the 2000s. But now we are seeing again, there is this so-called ICT bill that's supposed to be in the House. And they're doing the same thing with what they want to do to agricultural professionals. You have to sign up for this card, and then you have to go for this program to get this number of, points or certifications. So they're also throttling that space. But the absurdity of it is that ship sailed. Somebody needs to, I don't know, maybe you need a counseling at that level. Like, there are a whole bunch of people in there who, this idea, and I wrote about it when I talked about what's wrong with our elites. Again, it was about 4 or 5 years ago. I said, anything they do not understand, they can't profit from or kill out, it keeps them up at night. They need to have a total, almost hydra tentacled, grasp on anything going on. And that's why creativity scares them. It's licensing, it's regulations, it's more licensing, it's you need this, you don't do that. You try this creative thing, they throw 27 licenses at you, It's at some point that paranoia that comes with that system will have to be addressed. And that's why I keep saying I don't envy Ruto at this point, because again, that just adds to the bucket of things he maybe call a priest. But I saw them in status and they didn't look like they also understand what's going on. You look at some of the countries abroad, when some of these latest creativities in technology, some of them just came out and officially said, you know what, we'll let the system run until we see where it's going, it's fully developed, and then regulations will follow creativity, basically. And some of these countries have said that's the official policy. Now, here we want to work backwards to say, okay, we'll do regulations and then creativity has to stay in the regulation. It doesn't work. It's and then part of this my quest to understand that is what it does to their children, because and their capacity to express themselves out there, and what it does to, you know, because that is where you'll see it. How does it reflect and manifest on the attitudes of the young people towards this? And we can see part of what the young people are telling them in the streets right now. It's, you know, shape up or ship out. We cannot have this kind of everything has to be kept within, it's not even managerial.
Within your control.
Yeah, it's that level of bureaucracy. It's not even bureaucracy. It's not paranoia.
Yes.
I don't know. Maybe we'll get some psychiatrists to tell us what falls under, where anything that, you know, you can't co-opt or you don't understand or you can't keep a handle on, you just have to kill it. Like everything has to fit within the narrow world of sense making that you built. That's criminal, psychosis, so to speak. And so I don't know how long this country can sustain that. I don't think we have the room for it. The young are restless. The economy is, very tight. There's nothing for the extractives. Something has to give, and in a way, it's giving. So it's what direction will this go? And that's why when I hear people talk about young people need to come for a dialogue, we will give you jobs, I'm like, you don't get it. You just don't get it. That ship sailed. There's a whole world of conversations to be had within the country. And again, if they do not, or they're not willing to do it, they're going to have to be hounded out of that space. And that's not just applies to the political class. It cuts across pretty much every sector and every facet of our national life and existence. And I hope that, they'll let that shape up in good time, but I'm afraid they don't have the time. It's too late. The kids are in the streets.
Wow. Do you have any last words? God. Hey.
I mean, for just my sense of where we are, the presidential aspects and the political clusters. There's a lot of work that needs to be done there. There's the way we've shaped the structure, because when you look at it through the intergenerational lens, it's important to realize that in as much as we have an amazing country and in as much as we have a lot of robust systems here and there, when your elders can't afford to retire, when your millennials who are in their peak productivity and earning years cannot basically with installed mobility, when your Gen Zs are telling you the system is not working, then who's it working for? Because if we said it's working for those 5%, it's still also not, because we see them. I mean, we see, all this desire to prove to Kenyans that they're doing fine, which means they aren't. If they have to prove to Kenyans, we see their conduct on social media. You're creating an asylum here at this rate, because then you put so much anxiety on the elders, you put so much frustration on the millennials. You're creating a whole bunch of cynicism in the young people. The system has to go. That's just the straight and narrow of it. The system has to go. Yeah.
That's a good point on which to finish our conversation. Thank you so much. I've learned so much. I hope everyone else who listens to this will get some clarity on the issues going forward. So thank you so much.
You're welcome.